All right. Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you may be. Once again, I'm Matt and want to say thanks so much for registering today. We have a great session for you all. I do want to say that after the webinar, you will receive a recording of the webinar as well as a copy of the slides and your certificate of completion that's good to submit for 1.2 CEUs. We're very happy to share that with you. And that should be to you about an hour after the end of the webinar. So I have to let some things upload to share that with you guys, but expect that this afternoon, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Matt. Again, thanks everybody for jumping on and spending a couple minutes with us today. Our presenters for today's session are myself. My name is David Servadidio. I am the Director of Marketing for Provider of Trust, and my colleague Michael Rosen, who's a co-founder of Provider of Trust as well. So the two of us will take you through. We are super excited for today's presentation. If you have any questions throughout the session, I know Matt briefly mentioned this as well, but feel free to ask away via your meeting control panel. We'll address all the questions at the end of the webinar, and if you have any good ones throughout, we'll try to intersperse them as well. But please ask away. We'll do our best to answer any questions that come through. So a little bit about us. We like to say made with love in Nashville, Tennessee. We are a software, a healthcare and data company with a few software solutions. We're based in Nashville. We work with healthcare organizations across the country. Essentially what we do in a nutshell is we focus on ongoing healthcare license certification, sanction, and exclusion monitoring for health plans, health systems, and long-term care facilities. Everybody from some of the largest healthcare organizations in the world to the mom and pop clinics up and down the streets right next to our offices here in Nashville. Our software as a service solution is flexible and is adaptable to unique needs, and we map to different organizations. We deliver real-time, accessible data 24/7 online via secure accounts, and we're committed to our client success. All that to say is a lot of the insights that we deal with on a regular basis as it relates to our clients, and it relates to the industry in terms of just OIG exclusions, state exclusions, sanctions, licenses. Those are things that we deal with on an ongoing basis, which is why we love to present some of the insights we've found back to the industry so we can all learn and get a little bit better. Quick overview and quick agenda for today. Here's what we have. So my colleague Mike will kick it off with OIG Exclusion 101. What does this look like and everything you need to know about an exclusion. Fines and penalties associated with it, the actual data behind it. It's sort of a 101 quick overview. We'll then go into federal versus state exclusions. What are the similarities between the two? What are the differences between those disparate lists? How often do they communicate with each other? Some just baseline information about the relationship between federal exclusions and state exclusions. We'll go into just exclusion facts, right? There's a ton of good insights here. We mentioned that we get a lot of insight from our clients. This is where a lot of that will start to come out in terms of some of the things we see and the uniqueness of following exclusions from state to federal to discipline type. There's a lot of good information here, so please stay engaged. There's a lot to learn. And then we'll end it with essential two sections at the end: smarter monitoring and case studies. We'll use specific examples when data actually, one of our clients or one of our friends of the industry was able to use data in a unique way to identify an exclusion quicker, remove an excluded provider or an excluded employee faster, because they looked at data a little bit differently and managed their HR and compliance systems a little bit differently than I think is probably the industry norm. So we'll share some best practices around that. And then finally, measuring your exclusion screening, ... and there's in parentheses there, predictive analytics. This is where this industry is going. So there's a lot of discussion and a lot of brainstorming amongst the industry, both vendors like ourselves and also health systems and a lot of our client organizations about what's phase two. of exclusion monitoring and of exclusion screening, and what could that look like? And the reality is it's going very quickly towards the realm of predictive analytics. How do we use data to be smarter about our operations? How do we use data to be smarter about employee, vendor, provider network monitoring? And we'll show you exactly where we think the industry is heading based on everything we see, from data trends to relationships with our clients, and how organizations are starting to adapt to disparate data. So with that, we will kick it off with a quick poll question, just to do a quick pulse check. How frequently do you complete exclusion monitoring? Is this something that you are actively doing on hire, once a year, quarterly, monthly? I'm not sure if this maybe doesn't touch you directly and falls under a responsibility of a different department or a different team within your organization. Just we'd love to kind of see where everyone's at on this. I'll give it another minute or two as the votes are still coming in. So we will go ahead and share the results, and here's a quick glance at how we responded. So once upon hire, about 6% of us are doing this once looking for exclusions at hire. Another 6% are searching for exclusions once a year. 4% are doing this on a quarterly basis. So interesting, a little bit less on a quarterly basis than on an annual basis. The majority of our friends on the phone are doing this monthly, so monitoring for exclusions on a monthly basis. And then I'm not sure, is actually just shy of 20%. So a significant chunk of us may be on here just learning about the process and learning about the data that goes behind this, but may not touch this directly. So thanks for joining, even if this doesn't touch your direct day job. I'm certainly excited to have you. And with that, my colleague Mike will take it away.
Thanks, Dave. Well, I hope everyone's enjoying a sort of great mid-summer day. It is quite warm here in Nashville, but to be expected. We also want to remind you that if you have questions along the way, please submit them in the questions box, and we will be sure to get to them at the end. If there's one that we see coming in that's worth addressing at the moment, we will, but otherwise we'll address them at the end. So please feel free to ask away. So let's talk a little bit about exclusions here, and I'm going to assume that either you're relatively new to the exclusion market and what it means, and if you are an expert, hopefully you'll still take a little bit of new insight away. So exclusions are actually an administrative action. It's not a criminal matter. It may have resulted from a criminal matter, but it's actually a civil administrative action taken against either an individual or an entity, a vendor, a third party. And I think for a lot of people, that is news, that the OIG is very interested and has and does exclude companies as in addition to people. We'll talk about that a little bit later. The Office of Inspector General, the OIG, at Health and Human Services at the federal government is in charge of keeping this list and enforcing by issuing civil and monetary penalties and fines for companies that either employ an individual who's excluded or contract with a third party vendor or like a contractor, et cetera, physician on contract that is excluded. So we're going to talk about why that's important and where you need to be searching to avoid these fines. The good news is that the data is available publicly, and the fines are 100% avoidable. That is, if you're doing some form of monitoring to find it as soon as possible. So we'll talk about best practices there. The OIG mandates that any healthcare organization that is receiving in whole or in part, either directly or indirectly, federal healthcare dollars, that they cannot do that with or under contract with an individual or entity that's excluded. And we're going to talk about why that's the case in a minute, because it may sound ominous and eerie and big brotherish, but there's real good reason for it to protect the federal healthcare dollars. Federal healthcare dollars in this context would include Medicare, Medicaid, any of the CHIPs, the Children Healthcare programs, TRICARE for the military, and even grants at a teaching hospital. So we'll come back to that also in a little bit. Now, if an individual or a third party is excluded, you should not be using in whole or in part those dollars to reimburse for their salaries and or directly for the work that they're doing. So let's talk about the OIG at the federal level, because there are actually OIGs at the state level too, which you need to be aware of. But at the federal level, at HHS, this is not new. The Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General is one of the largest inspector generals in the US government. It was created in 1976, so not new, and it oversees hundreds of programs to protect the dollars and the integrity of HHS programs. Since the 70s, they have had the authority do issue and have the stick to wave, if you will, to impose fines and penalties for all types of fraud, waste, and abuse. And that's what we're trying to avoid by not working with, employing, or contracting with someone who is excluded. So you may ask yourself, where would this exclusion, remember, it's an administratively issued sanction, if you will. Where could they come from? And there are multiple places. It could start at the state Medicare fraud control unit. So if you, Medicaid. So if you're involved in receiving Medicaid funded dollars through your state, the OIG or the Attorney General in that state will be looking to enforce for fraud and abuse. So that may be ultimately where it starts. Could also, in most of the time, in fact, almost half of the OIG exclusions stem from an issue with a state license. So the individual is a licensed individual and they have committed a misdemeanor or felony affecting patient care, substance abuse, or patient abuse, or fraud and abuse. And the licensing board takes action, revokes, suspends, does something with that individual's license. And as a result, you're going to see by statute, the OIG would then pick up and exclude them. So we'll talk about a best practice to do license monitoring in conjunction with exclusions to find those before they become an exclusion. It could be both a misdemeanor or felony that gets you there at a criminal matter or state licensing board. And for those of you who are new to exclusion monitoring, actually, if your individual is in default of their federal student loan, they will and can for a period of time be excluded. So lots of ways that an exclusion can make its way up to a state or federal authority. So there are two types of exclusions, whether they're at the state or federal government. They're either mandatory by statute or permissive. And simply put, mandatory would be resulting from a matter that is a felony. And the felonies by category that would be mandatory would be substance abuse, patient abuse, fraud and abuse. If you have some form of action that makes its way up to and either through the criminal courts or licensing board that results in that, by statute, the federal government at the OIG has to add you to their list. And if it comes from, say, a licensing board or a Medicaid fraud control unit down at the state level, they're supposed to report all those actions within 30 days of taking it to the OIG so they can add them to the OIG list. If that occurs, you'll be excluded. That individual or entity will be excluded for a minimum of 5 years and can be indefinite. We'll show you some cases by way of example. If it is for a misdemeanor for any of those matters, substance abuse, patient abuse, fraud and abuse, or default on a federal student loan, it's permissive, meaning that the OIG has the discretionary authority to add them or not to add them. And they've released some guidance about a year and a half ago about what factors they take in consideration. It's worth looking at, but it is discretionary on their part. Regardless, whether it's mandatory or permissive, it's still an exclusion and has the same impact for fines. So here are your mandatory, as we mentioned on the previously, for felonies, and permissive exclusions, which we mentioned for misdemeanors. Primarily, default on federal student loan is permissive, and you'll see that here. Let's talk about what those penalties and fines are. So they're, again, 100% avoidable. You should never have to pay this if you're monitoring and screening your employees and vendors. But in the event that you don't, or you miss it, this is what the OIG will fine you. And there's really not much of a defense. You're either on this list and subject to the fine, or you're not. For each item that you claim or bill for that individual. So if they're a licensed provider, they're a nurse, they're a physical therapist, and you can on a daily basis identify, and you're billing Medicare, Medicaid, one of the agencies for their services, for each patient that they see, each item that they claim, each surgical tray that's prepared, it's $10,000 per item claim per day, times the total amount of days that you're in that category, times 3. This becomes extremely expensive very fast. And if you are non-billable and you're even in HR or an administrative person or in finance, you're not even licensed as a caregiver, but you're excluded, then it's based on your salary and benefits for the time in which you're excluded times 3. Now, your company, for employing or contracting an excluded party, and if you do it on if you're clearly not monitoring and this is a pattern, your company itself can become excluded, and you can lose the right to bill CMS for services if you do not fix it. There is an additional, we don't have time for today to discuss, but each of the items you claim while that person is excluded is actually a false claim. And that's a whole nother set of penalties and fines that you would be subjected to. So penalties and fines, we don't like to sell fear. We just want to educate you on what's out there. Dave, why don't you pick up on that? And
yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Mike. Before we start our next section is federal versus state exclusions. We'll have one more poll question just to get a sense of what everybody's searching out there. We have a sense of frequency, how often all of us on the call are searching exclusions and monitoring for exclusions, but would love to get a sense of how many different exclusion sources that we are all checking. So just a quick quiz. How many different exclusion sources are there? We have 2, 12, 44, and 50 exclusion sources in total. We'll give it another minute. Votes are still coming in. Give it another second or two. And we'll go ahead and close the poll. And we can see the answers are all across the board, actually. So 41% of us think that there are 2 exclusion sources. 24% of us think that there are 12 exclusion sources. And 17% of us think that there are 44 exclusion sources. And 18% of us think that there are 50 exclusion sources. The correct answer is actually C, 44. There are 44 exclusion sources, and we'll go into what exactly those are in a minute. Go ahead, Mike, take it away.
Sure. So this is always the poll slide that we find the most interesting, because I think the market is still learning about this and the depth in which proper exclusion monitoring really needs to include. The correct answer is 44 currently as of today. And I will tell you, when we just 2 years ago were doing these webinars, there were only about 25 states that had publicly released an exclusion source. Today there are 42. There should be 50. All states should be and will one day release their data publicly. As of today, 42 states have done so. We include all those in all of our screening. But let's back up to the federal level. So we talked about the OIG's list and whether it's mandatory or permissive and how they make their way up there through licensing boards and criminal matters, et cetera. Regardless of that list, that is the granddaddy, the one that most people in the industry at least are searching upon hire and should be searching on a monthly basis, according to the OIG, their guidance, and CMS rules. There is an additional one that used to be called the Excluded Party List System that the Government Services Administration held. It is now wrapped into a larger data set called SAM.gov. And basically that list is inclusive of lots of different agency matters, but the ones that you should be aware of for healthcare would be ones involving a matter in which a contractor with the federal government that has a GSA number has defaulted under their contract or committed fraud. So these are companies that have run afoul with the government in their own contract or services, and you should not be doing business with. And so that's an additional federal data set. So your two federal, for those of you who answered two, you were probably thinking OIG and SAM, and you're correct, except there are an additional 42 states that also have lists. And those are the state Medicaid lists that we talked about. We're going to talk briefly about the OIG website here. For those of you who have been to it, this should look very familiar. If you're new to the industry, this is something you should become very familiar with. So the OIG actually publishes for free their list. You can search it one at a time or up to 5 at a time on their site. A couple of things that are worth noting. The OIG does not contain all of the exclusions that we just talked about. They do not contain the SAM exclusions, and they do not include the 42 state exclusions. In fact, they're supposed to have all of the state exclusions because, as you remember, each Medicaid fraud control unit agreed to send all their data to the OIG within 30 days. When we audit that, we know that, in fact, they're missing 2/3 of what is at the state. So do not rely on OIG only to gather either SAM or any of the other states. You should include those 3 categorical sets together. When you do search a name, whether it's an individual or an entity at the OIG, realize that all that is required is last name first or the name of the entity. When you have John Smith and you see that there are 14 that come up, you're going to have to go through each one to determine whether or not it's your John Smith. And to do so, you will need the Social Security number or the tax ID number of the EIN for a vendor. So in the back end of the OIG database does contain Social Security numbers, but for obvious identity theft reasons, you're not going to see it. You have to type it in when there's a possible record, and it will say that number matches or does not match the name provided. So whether you're doing your monitoring upon hire or monthly, somebody is going to have to go through this data set. You can also download the data set and try to build your own software to search against. But again, it will not give you the Social Security numbers. You're going to have to do that one by one. Now, moving from the OIG list back to our 42 state lists, I thought you might find it interesting to know that only 4 of the 42 states actually allow you to match with the social, which is the best way to determine if the excluded individual is yours. And that is because people who, in particular females, may have a maiden name, a new married name, a divorced name back to a different name, a hyphenated name. And so Social Security number would tie those things together. When only 4 states allow you to use that, it exposes you on the other states to a name only, or a name and an address, which is not very helpful on a common name. There are 10 of the 42 states that do allow you to download the database in a PDF format, for which you would then have to convert, put into some searchable format, and it will come in various rows of data, nothing consistent. So it is a mixed match out there. It is data that comes in lots of raw data formats, and is quite time consuming if you're to do this on your own, or we're going to show you how we do it differently and can save you some time.
And just to piggyback on what Mike had said, is we have a quick example from our data team here, and what we've estimated is the actual activities and the time associated with those activities to monitor about 1,000 employees on an ongoing basis. And when we say ongoing, really we're talking monthly, and when different lists update within each frequency within that time frame of a month. Mike mentioned there's 44 exclusion lists. The reality is not all of those update on the same day. That would be amazing if they did, and very easy for all of us to manage. But the reality is Some of those update weekly, some of them update monthly, some of them actually update quarterly or even less. For us, to stay on top of that requires some monitoring of the actual primary source, in addition to monitoring your employees against those primary sources. So here's a quick breakdown of what we would estimate it takes to monitor about 1,000 employees on a monthly basis. Step one is to locate and download all exclusion lists every time updated. If you're on this call and you were one of the respondents that are only searching 2 exclusion lists or even less, feel free to reach out to us. We'd be happy to share the actual primary source links with you. If you're looking for your state or looking for your list, we'd love to help out. So if you're looking for a particular state and need help with step one, locating the exclusion lists, let us know. We'd be happy to help. We estimate that takes about 8 hours on a monthly basis to locate them all, download them all, and put them into a searchable format. Step two is convert some of the PDF lists, as Mike went on the previous slide. 10 states publish their exclusion lists in PDF form. To convert them into a searchable Excel form or some other form, we estimate it takes about 4 hours a month based on those states that update with monthly or more frequent frequency. Modify public exclusion data to associate unique identifiers with it. We'll get into a few case studies on this, but Mike pointed out before that the OIG LEIE does not contain social security number when you download it from their site. So we include this as a best practice would be how do you modify that public exclusion data to include things that help you to more quickly and more accurately verify is this my employee or is this my vendor that's associated with an exclusion list, whether that's the OIG LEIE or one of the 42 state lists as well. We would recommend that you go through a process and actually enhance that public data to make it easy to verify. Group exclusions together. This takes, we would recommend about 200 hours up front plus about 20 hours on a monthly basis. What we mean by this is people that show up on multiple exclusion lists. We will get into a case study in a minute, but a really good example is somebody gets excluded in Delaware and 3 months later, that same person is excluded at the OIG LEIE. It's very possible and very likely actually that those exclusion records contain different sets of data. Maybe it's a different name, maybe it's a different address, or even a different other unique identifier. Grouping those together because you've recognized it's the same person, we would recommend to quickly verify and quickly make sure you're monitoring against the most accurate public source data. Another really good example of this is owners of a vendor. So monitoring your vendors and monitoring the entity that may be associated with an exclusion list. Are we monitoring the owners of anybody that owns 5% or more of your partner companies? It's very possible that an owner would end up on an exclusion list and not the company, or vice versa. The company ends up on exclusion list, but maybe not the owner. Having a process in place to associate exclusions together, we would recommend is a good step. Searching each employee or vendor by unique combination of identifiers, we would estimate that takes about 5 minutes per search. Searching each employee by nickname and possible misspellings or potential former names, as in maybe a maiden name for an employee of yours. We estimate it takes about 10 minutes per search. And then to actually verify with a social or a tax ID or even an NPI number would take about 5 minutes to complete that verification and to input that back into whatever data process y'all are using internally. We estimate then that this takes about 400 hours up front and about 384 hours a month of work to do for 1,000 employees. If you have more than 1,000 employees, this naturally begins to scale a little bit. And if you have less than 1,000 employees, it essentially scales back a little bit, as would make sense. But overall, this takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of effort. And here's why it becomes so important to actually go through this step and go through this effort of checking federal and state exclusion sources. So you'll see at the top, there are about 70,000 OIG exclusions published on the OIG's list, the LEIE. There's an additional about 70,000 exclusions that are published on SAM that are healthcare related. SAM includes some other stuff that's non-healthcare related, but there's about 70,000 exclusions that are published on SAM and are healthcare related. In addition, when you aggregate all of these state exclusion lists, those 42 states, there's about another 70,000 exclusions that exist on all of those 42 states combined. Some states have thousands and thousands of exclusion lists. Some states only have a few hundred. But overall, when you total them up, there's about 70,000. Overall, the number of exclusions that we all are trying to monitor employees and vendors against on a monthly or more frequent basis is just north of 200,000 total healthcare exclusions that exist today. It's important to note that this is growing. So this number is not stagnant. The OIG, as an example, adds several thousand exclusions to their list on an annual basis. It's continually growing monthly, but when you look at the aggregate, it's growing by thousands. That's also true with state exclusion lists and SAM exclusion lists. And then 43% of all OIG exclusions happen because of a license revocation. So Mike went through a little bit of detail on why somebody might get excluded. And the reality is 43% of those start with some sort of a license issue. States are required to report exclusions to the OIG in 30 days. What we see as the actual average time, this is a year-to-date metric, is for a state to go into reporting an exclusion to the federal data set is about 173 days. And the last metric on this slide is the average year-to-date penalty by the OIG for employing or contracting with an excluded employee or vendor is $126,000 is what you see on that top. So at a glance, there's your nutshell of the universe of exclusions to monitor.
Dave, let me add 2 points to this because this is a summary slide of what you just covered. There's 2 points I want to mention and highlight for you. In the $126,000 average number, so that's taking the fines that were issued divided by the number of people. Now, in some cases, the fines could be $19,000 because they were only excluded for a month before it was determined. In some cases, it could be a couple of $100,000 because they were there for a longer period of time, or it involved more than one person. So on average, it's 126. The important part about that is that, remember we talked about a $10,000 for every item billed or claimed, not reimbursed. If there is no defense, if you say, well, yeah, I billed you, CMS, for Dave's services, and sure, he was excluded and I shouldn't have, but you never reimbursed me. You stopped it before it ever came to me. So there's no fine. It does not work that way. Simply claiming it or submitting it is a false claim and therefore subjects you to the fine. Secondly, remember they're going to multiply for the time period that person was employed or billing times 3. If you, however, as an entity, a company, in your compliance find that you for some reason have missed this exclusion and you self-report it to the OIG, at the federal OIG, which is what you should do when you discover it, the OIG will reduce the 3-time multiplier to 1.5. So in most of these cases where you see the $126,000 average, they were from a self-disclosure. So really the average fine is double that, right? Because they would have only paid a 1.5 multiple by turning themselves in, if you will, to the OIG, rather than if the OIG had come after them, that number would be closer to $300,000. So again, best practice, if you discover you have this issue, the OIG would rather you go to them and say, we've discovered this, we've remedied it, and we know we owe you some money. Do not run and hide from the OIG. It will cost more.
Absolutely. The last add I'll say there is a stat that you'll see on that slide when you get it is the average time it takes for a state exclusion to appear on the OIG list is 173 days. I'll just add that there are numerous state exclusions that never or have not to date appeared on the OIG's list. That mean that they may take years to appear, and there are several of them that are not there now. So relying on the OIG as an umbrella to catch all state exclusions simply isn't a good suggestion. And then as we move into the next section of smarter monitoring, and smarter monitoring is really, just to get into this before, is here's where we think the industry is going, is instead of just aggregating lists and getting a process around screening on a monthly basis, it's getting smarter about managing employee and or vendor data on the front end so that we are built to respond well in the event of we catch an exclusion. So here's what we mean. When we go into smarter monitoring, we would recommend a proactive approach. We had a stat before that was 43% of exclusions result from some sort of a license issue. Maybe that's a revocation, maybe it's a disciplinary action taken by a state board. What we would recommend, and we encourage our clients to take, is a proactive approach, which is monitor licenses for sanctions or revocations before an exclusion results. Because of that, you'd be able, if you're working, compliance is working in conjunction with HR, you may be able to catch potential exclusions before they happen and before they become a problem. We would recommend connecting the dots between HR and compliance to make sure when there is an issue with a license that that employee or that vendor is somehow identified or flagged in whatever your management system are, so you have the ability to be proactive and catch things before they become real problems. Search and monitor for all former names and nicknames of employees. Maiden names is a common thing we see on exclusion lists, and we see that with our clients happen all the time. Jenny Smith gets married and changes her name to Jenny Jones, but there is an exclusion for Jenny Smith, the maiden name. Are you searching Jenny Smith, or do you have a data process in place so that if Jenny Jones comes on an exclusion list, you have some sort of identifier, maybe it's a social or an NPI, to be able to reference against the exclusion list to make sure you're catching people that have changed their names. If you think about this, we see a number of different trends in exclusion data that have evolved over time as this category has really started to develop. One of them is name changes. So it's not a crazy idea to think that somebody who may be excluded intentionally changes their name to try to continue to work in healthcare or continue to bill Medicare, Medicaid. It's actually more common than you might think. So we see the maiden name or a name change type issue happen very frequently as it relates to exclusions. The other one is we see state jumping happen quite a bit. So an excluded person who gets excluded in the state of Tennessee, our home state, may move to Kentucky, just one state north, and try to continue to work in healthcare. And then an exclusion may show up in Kentucky at a later date. We see that state hopping being a geographic trend as well, which is why it's so important to not just monitor your own state, but to monitor at minimum the surrounding states. And we would recommend all, because excluded people tend to move. And the last bullet you'll see on the slide is partner with a third party who has a database, a better net to help you catch this if you are unable to build this internally or build this yourself. So we've kind of given you the playbook for what we would recommend as building a smarter data set or a smarter monitoring. Certainly we're a company that is in this space and does this type of work. There are others out there, and we would encourage you to at least explore what this could look like to partner with a third party who might be able to help you build a bigger, more proactive net, including the license piece, including the exclusions piece, and has that smarter data capability. And then the slide after essentially is just a quick visual just to say, from a risk and an effort standpoint, what does it take to do smarter monitoring? Starting from left to right, if you're just searching the OIG, that's the least amount of effort this takes from a monthly basis. But the highest amount of risk, because as we showed before, you're only catching about 1/3 of exclusions as you start to kick off your monthly process. Incorporating just the OIG and the SAM, so the two federal data sets, the effort gets a little bit more, but your risk goes down a little bit because now you're now covering 2/3 of potential healthcare exclusions, but you're leaving out a pretty key third as well. When you add in the states, you are now catching and casting your net across all healthcare exclusions, which takes a lot of effort, but your risk is still there. And that's the important piece here, is where we see the industry going is doing the OIG, doing the SAM, and monitoring all of the states and having a smarter monitoring process in place. That is where we can collectively as an industry start to eliminate risk in our process. And that includes things like checking former last names or using predictive analytics to try to catch an exclusion when it's just a license issue before it becomes a state or a federal exclusion. That's the next level of an effective exclusion monitoring process.
And before we move on, guys, I've got a couple questions here that I think fit in really well. So whoever thinks they can answer the best. But Sandy asks, can I go back as an example and pull the names that were excluded in a previous month now that the July list has been published?
And when you mean go back and rerun it?
So Sandy says OIG updates, they update their list monthly.
Correct.
So she's asking if you can go back, if those lists are different, or they are, from what I understand, just new exclusions are added to the list.
Correct. New exclusions are added, and then there's another feature that we haven't talked about, in which an individual who once was excluded has now passed their exclusion time period. Say it was 5 years, and it's now 6 years later. They are entitled to, but they have to proactively seek it to get reinstated, meaning that they can now go back to the OIG and say, okay, I did what you said for 5 years. I stayed out of healthcare. Now I've got my license back. I've got my life back in order. I want to be reinstated. If they're reinstated, they're going to come off the list. So the list update each month, which comes out sometime between the 10th and the 12th each month from the OIG, will include new exclusions and remove those who've been reinstated. So you should, Sandy, be taking that list, your current list of employees, and each month, at least, I would wait until at least the 12th of October, or the 12th of each month. You can set the 15th to be extra careful and diligent, that the OIG, might be a weekend or something on one of those days. But certainly by the middle of the month, each month, the OIG has released and published their most current list of new and reinstated individuals. So you need to do that. Great question.
And one more quick question before we move on. Karen asks, would you recommend that volunteers be screened for exclusions?
Yeah, Karen, we get asked this quite a bit. So in the way we suggest is it's a risk tolerance analysis, but follow the dollar. It's all about the federal healthcare reimbursement. If you are not using federal healthcare dollars in any way, shape, or form because you're not compensating those individuals for their volunteer time, then arguably no, you do not have to search them. We have clients who choose to do it because they want to just go ahead and be best practice, or those volunteers actually have direct access to patient care, and it could be argued that they're involved in some fashion or not in reimbursement, and so they choose to. But technically, follow the healthcare dollar. If they're volunteers and they're coming in part-time because they're in high school and they want to get something on their resume, no, you don't have to.
Thanks, Mike. We're going to roll on for the sake of time here, but we will cover the questions that we can at the end.
Yeah.
All right. We got one more poll question, I think.
One more poll question. How do you complete your exclusion monitoring? And this might help us a lot for some of the questions that are coming in too. So the answers are internally checking the OIG, internally checking OIG and SAM, internally checking federal lists and my state, internally checking federal lists in all states, and then a third-party vendor as well, helping you with this process. So appreciate everybody staying engaged, and thank you in advance for not only for voting on the polls, but for submitting questions. We're looking at them here, and there are several good ones that we will make sure we cover at the end. So appreciate you sending those in, and please continue to do so as we'll cover them. So thanks for voting. Here are the quick results. So we've got 13% of you said internally we're checking the OIG. 10% of you said internally we're checking OIG and SAM. 18% said internal, we're checking federal lists and my state only. 6% said internal, checking federal state lists and all states. And 53% of you saying we're using a third-party vendor to help us with this.
Just for your edification, by the way, just so you can benchmark your best practice against others, there are over 150 people in attendance today on this webinar. So that gives you an idea where you fall among your fellow colleagues in the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Mike. The next section for us is we'll go into 2 quick case studies. These are real life examples that we saw or we've seen in either the news or in the industry that we thought were really great illustrations to go through and illustrate some of these data points, as well as some of the stuff we've seen with our own client base as well, that are just good examples of some of the stuff we've talked about. So Mike, take it away with
Sure.
first.
The first one may be someone you know from the news, certainly a bad actor. Larry Nassar has been in the news. For those of you who just saw the ESPY Awards, where Ali Raceman, who has just been a champion among victims' rights, spoke out very bravely. Larry is the Michigan State doctor associated with all the sports there and has a plethora of issues with abusing now and convicted for sexually abusing a number of innocent women. It's actually interesting about him individually, because if you were to type in, as his name is broadcast across all publications, Larry Nassar, you will miss him in the OIG because he's actually Lawrence Nassar. So there's one example of how even doing it in-house and not utilizing smarter monitoring would in fact miss his known exclusion. But let's go backwards and see what happened to this I can't even call him gentleman, this man. He was indicted in 2016 for the first time for his sexual predator issues. In Michigan, where he was practicing, he actually became excluded on their list in February of 17. Now, by the 30-day rule, March of 17, Sandy, you would have expected to have found him on the next update. Didn't happen until July, and that's actually fast for a state to report in the OIG to put on there. No surprise here. It was a felony, multiple, that he was convicted of, so it's mandatory. Okay, so the OIG saw it when they were given it by Michigan and said, and or on their own took their own action separate than Michigan in July. So there's an example of a time deadline and in which it could be in multiple sources. He was sentenced in 18. If you had not searched this correctly or waited for the OIG to publish its list, you would have had 4 months of exposure at Michigan for him being on that list of excluded individuals. So there's someone that you probably know by name and a great example of the number of ways and pitfalls that could cause for your company. Dave, why don't you take the next one?
Sure, and here's just a quick example number 2, and this is one that we were able to solve specifically for one of our clients, but it's a really common situation that we see in both the state and federal data sets as well. I'll read from left to right. So June 2016, stay with me for a second. Allegation of theft of money from a patient. There was an allegation against an employee of a health system. In January 2017, a state licensing board, issues an administrative action against this person. In June of 2017, so a full year later from an allegation, licensing board issues administrative action against the person. In June of 2017, there's also, again, with that administrative action, there's no defense by the person, so the board revoked the license. In January 2018 is when the exclusion hits. So from the allegation in 2016 to June of 2017, a year later, there is a 6-month gap between the licensing board when they administered a state sanction and a revocation. There is 6 months later, an OIG excludes the person because of a license revocation. So right there, when we talk about predictive analytics and predictive monitoring, that's a 6-month gap that if you're on top of your compliance department is connected to your HR processes and license management and monitoring, there's a 6-month gap between a license issue and how that connects to an exclusion 6 months later. In January 2018 as well, SAM also excludes the person based on the OIG exclusion. In May 2018, so 5 months after the exclusion is published, as Sally Jones, one of our clients hires this person in May 2018 based on the pre-hire background check that they did before they brought this employee into their organization. They searched the name Sally Jones, and no exclusion was found because Sally Jones was actually excluded under a different name. Her name had changed. May 2018, Sally Jones, with her new name, was uploaded into Provider Trust the day after hire, right? So pre-hire, no exclusion was found based on the internal process. Day one of employment, they're uploaded into Provider Trust, and we were able to find the exclusion immediately. The reason why we were able to find that exclusion is because of that smarter monitoring and data enhancement that we do on primary source exclusion lists. We enhance exclusions with unique data points that allow us to verify based on more than just name or more than just an address. We look at things like social or an NPI or even a license. In this case, we were able to connect a license to an individual that had changed their name in the process. And then May 2018, immediately when we found that, all is within a few days of this person being hired, we were able to return a definitive exclusion match to the client, and the employee was terminated. Just an example of how this looks from a timeline standpoint and why it's so important to have a good data process as it relates to an ongoing search. So when you bring individuals into your organization, how do you have a net big enough to be able to catch things? And here's our final poll question. I know we're running a little bit short on time, and we're almost done. Do you capture and monitor former employee names? I actually know some of the attendees on this call. I've actually asked that as a question, so I'm interested to hear kind of what the responses are. Yes, no, or I'm not sure, depending on your position in the organization. So we'll give it another minute, and we will go ahead and close the poll. And you'll see the results on the screen. So about 38% say yes, we do capture and monitor former last names. 32% say no, we do not capture and monitor former last names, and about 30% also say I'm not sure, given given your position in the organization or your how closely related you are to the process of exclusion monitoring. And so with that then, we'll go through these last few slides pretty quickly. Our last section is measuring your exclusion monitoring, and Mike, take it away.
Sure. So as a recap, we think you should ask yourselves and go back if you are unsure or new, and look at and review your own processes. What sources are you monitoring? You now know there are 3 categorical sources, 2 federal and 42 state. And are you doing best practice or close enough to it to satisfy your risk tolerance? Secondly, are you looking at former names because the OIG holds you responsible for an excluded party? And the reason that you really don't have much of defense here is on the application, they're going to give you a former or maiden or last name. So you were put on notice, you just chose to only search the current name. The OIG doesn't really give you any empathy there. And then don't forget your vendors and third-party contractors, because they too can be excluded. And so are you including them in your program? Lastly, do you know how much time it's taking your organization to complete the monitoring? Would you think that it is easier for a third party to do it? Third parties in our industry assume contractual liability. So if we missed a record, we're the ones who are having to reimburse you for the fine. If you miss it, you're coming out of your own coffers to do so. Do you add the license and monitoring of it so you can find out an event before it reaches an exclusion? Keep in mind that if Dave Servadidio loses his license and continues to practice, you got different issues before he gets excluded. You got issues of false claims, you got issues with the state licensing board, and you've got potential negligence issues there too. And then how do you calculate and try to reduce your risk? There are 3 products. Dave, you might want to briefly touch on each of these, and then we'll get into the questions that have come in.
Yeah. Just to quickly wrap up here, we just wanted to give an overview, kind of a little bit more specifically of who we are and what we do. We have a couple different service lines that actually help our clients solve a number of these different processes. On the left, we do have a solution called Exclusion Check. It's actually free to try. So if you go to exclusioncheck.com right now, you can actually search instantly. Functions a little bit like Google for exclusions. Across all OIG, SAM, and 42 states instantly for free. Passport is a predictive analytics solution that we employ predictive monitoring against your employee networks to check licenses and exclusions. And then we do have a vendor-proof solution as well to ensure vendor management and vendor compliance, tying things like owners to companies and monitoring them as an entity as a holistic approach. And with that, you'll get all these slides and get a copy of all of this at the end. But we do have a few more questions. We've got about 5 minutes left. So I know there's at least 2 or 3 more that have come in.
Yeah, so we'll be able to answer these pretty quickly, but I do want to remind everybody that you will be receiving your CEU certificate along with those resources that we'll share this afternoon. So be on the lookout for that. It's a really easy code to type in and get some credit. So we're happy to offer that. Jill has a question here. Where do you find your state's exclusion list?
Jill, it's a really good question. They are all published in different places. So I would strongly recommend that to reach out to us, and we will be happy to point you in the right direction of where the primary source is. For different states, they're housed on different, mostly government type websites as the publication method. But we're experts in that. Just send us a quick email, and we will be happy to send you a link.
Thanks, Dave. Jill asks, is it okay to just check the OIG supplemental update each month?
Well, if you do that, Jill, you should be doing it monthly for sure. But you will then miss out on up to 2/3 of those state exclusions. And let me revisit that for you or add something. So an example of an individual like Lawrence Nassar, he first was excluded in Michigan, and I haven't looked into whether or not, I'm assuming based on the felony, that the Michigan reported it to the OIG and therefore they added it. But the OIG could take separate action directly, not worried about whether a state is going to. So an individual could be excluded at Michigan and the OIG, just the OIG, et cetera. There's lots of places where they can. And so by not searching any of those other data sets, Jill, you'll be missing out on up to 2/3 of 70,000 state exclusions, and of course another SAM set of about 69,000. So, but searching on a monthly basis of each update will give you the most current OIG list of excluded individuals or entities.
Great, thanks, Mike. Jennifer asks, what is the best method to rule out a match with the OIG when you don't have date of birth, social security number for an individual or any additional info for a vendor?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Step one in that process is to at least make sure you have a way to generate some potential matches. So do you have a way to effectively and efficiently screen state and federal exclusion lists to at least generate some possibles? That's, I think, step one that so many of us on the phone might be challenged with. Assuming we've achieved that, and we can get down to a point where there are potential matches, the more data, the better. So the more data you have on this particular individual, if that's an address, if it's a potential license number, if it's any former names or anything like that, if it's a practice address or a former employment history that you have that address as well. The more data you have, the closer you can get to verifying an exclusion. To essentially to get 100% validity on whether or not it is or is not a match, you will need a unique identifier. Whether you're paying a vendor to do that or whether you are doing that yourself, at some point you'll get close enough where you're pretty sure, but you might not be fully sure. That's where we would recommend, and this happens with clients of ours, we would recommend, if you're pretty sure, to go back to that individual and ask them for a social security number so that you can verify. Because you will need a unique identifier. That said, without unique identifiers, you can get close. assuming you have an efficient process for screening very quickly, to at least narrow it down based on address or license or whatever it might be, work history, anything like that. You can get close.
Thanks, Dave. And we have one last question here, and those that have sent some questions in and we're not going to be able to get to, do appreciate the question, and we will get back to you away from the webinar here. But Carrie has our last question. If someone is excluded on a state list but hasn't made it to the OIG or SAM yet, is it a violation to file a claim for services provided by that person during the time they're not yet on the federal list?
I love that question. I was going to ask it myself if no one else did. So you do not have liability at the OIG until it hits the OIG. All right. So in Dr. Nassar's case, you would have had an issue with Michigan's Medicaid billings from whatever month that was, February, I think it was, that it was posted, but not at or by the OIG until July when they posted it. Now, from July forward, you have an issue both at the OIG and have had one in Michigan. So it all has to do with the publication date. You are not held responsible for knowing what you shouldn't or couldn't have known until it's public. And once it's public is when you should have known.
Thanks, Mike. And just want to say, as we wrap up here, thanks so much for everybody joining us today. Please make sure to sign up for our next webinar, which is also pre-approved for CEUs. And please let us know if you have any topics that you would be interested in hearing. We're always looking to tell you guys more about what you want to hear about. So please don't hesitate there. And thanks so much. Hope you guys have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.